If everyone could just mute your cell phone, that would be really great, just so we don't have any interruptions. As you probably know, I'm John Rannick. I'm the Director of Development here at the Marshall Foundation. Paul is coming back from Boston after picking up his daughter Sophie from Worcester College, and so we look forward to having him back in the office tomorrow. And really do appreciate you all taking your time to be with us this evening. It's going to be a very special night, and programs like the Legacy Series are central to our foundation's public mission, bringing leading historians, authors, and thinkers into conversation with the life, legacy, and world of George C. Marshall. They allow us not only to share serious scholarship with the wider public, but to keep Marshall's example present in the life of our community. And this work depends on the generosity of those who make these programs possible. And I really want to thank our sponsors tonight. They include Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation, Edward Jones right here in town, Cornerstone Bank here in town, the Lexington Sunrise Rotary Club, Raymond James, and also Mr. Ted Jutt, who made a nice gift to the Legacy Series. So we greatly appreciate all of them and all of your support as well. Your support enables us to do what we do. I also sincerely appreciate my colleagues Melissa Davis, Glenn Carpenter, Alice Lee, and Lee McFadden, who just celebrated a birthday yesterday. So please be sure to wish Lee a happy birthday for their hard work putting this event together. So before we turn to tonight's speaker, we wanted to take care of one bit of little institutional history. As you probably know, on May 23rd, 1964, a day that was, by all accounts, even hotter than this one, Lexington welcomed President Lyndon B. Johnson, former President Dwight Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Governor Albertus Harrison, and General Omar Bradley, Robert Lovett, and Dr. Forrest Pogue for the dedication of this building. And the formal beginning, really, of the Marshall Foundation research mission here. So late last year, our supporter Alex Macheras sent us some remarkable footage of that ceremony, and we've been saving it for this evening since we're so close to the dedication of our building, and we hope that you enjoy it. So I will advance and we'll show you this clip here. Okay, so our speaker tonight is Christopher C. Gorham, and a number of us staff here present had a chance to see Chris speak in Richmond earlier this month and gave the same talk, so I know you're in for a real treat. And Chris holds a bachelor's degree from University of Michigan, a master's degree from Tufts University, and a JD from Syracuse University. And after practicing law for more than a decade, he taught history for 15 years at Westford Academy outside of Boston. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and other publications. His first book, The Confidant, The Untold Story of the Woman Who Helped Win World War II and Shape Modern America, told the story of Anna Rosenberg, a remarkable public servant whose career intersected directly with George C. Marshall when Marshall appointed her Assistant Secretary of Defense. The Confidant was a Goodreads Choice Award finalist, and Christopher spoke about that book here at the Marshall Foundation in 2023. That earlier talk is available on our YouTube channel, but for anyone watching this, Communication Director Glenn Carpenter wants to first point you to something new. Glenn?
Hey everyone, this is Glenn back here at the Streamlab. Now I had the pleasure of interviewing Christopher about Anne Rosenberg for the first episode of Age of Marshall, our new podcast about George C. Marshall, his era, and the world he helped shape. Now the first 6 episodes launch next Thursday, May 26th. May 28th. If y'all are signed up for Marshall Moments, as I hope you all are, you will be getting that as the main feature. And for our YouTube friends, I see we have about 18 right now. You can sign up for our mailing list at the link in the description box to be notified when they go live. It's a great episode, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy it.
Thanks, Glenn. And just as a note, Christopher's 2023 legacy lecture was so strong and so well attended that over dinner after, we told him whenever his next book came out, we wanted him to come back to the foundation. So fortunately for us, that next book has now arrived, and tonight is proof that we keep our promises. Last fall, Chris publishes his second book, Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Nazi-Occupied France. It received rave reviews and was the winner of the 2025 Marfield Prize and the National Award for Arts Writing. Spotlighting the years of World War II when Henri Matisse and his family defiantly refused to evacuate Nazi-occupied France, this groundbreaking book illuminates the previously untold history of their passionate role in the resistance and the prodigious revolutionary work the artists produced in the face of fascism, violence, and hate. Matisse at War is the subject of this lecture this evening, so please join me in a warm welcome for Christopher Gorham.
I too have, before I get started, I do have a short video trailer that I'd like to show here.
By 1939, Henri Matisse was not the celebrated artist he had been earlier in the century. His wife was divorcing him, his health was failing, and in May of 1940, Hitler's blitzkrieg struck. Denmark and Norway fell, then the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium.
Das Ziel heißt Paris.
German panzer divisions crashed into France. Within a week, they were in the heart of the country, cleaving it in two.
Weit auseinandergezogen, rückt die Infanterie vor.
By the 3rd week of June, it was over. France surrendered. As millions of Parisians fled south and west from the German occupiers, hundreds of artists fled France altogether.
All artists, one way or another, had been affected by the war.
Composers, poets, and writers were deemed enemies of the state, and painters labeled as degenerate artists. But France's most famous modernist refused to leave. At age 70, Henri Matisse would stay.
It seemed to me as if I would be deserting. If everyone of value leaves, what will become of France?
In 1940, Matisse left Paris on a 100-day odyssey through occupied territory to Nice.
I want you to go to occupied France.
What do we do when we get there?
Organize resistance, act as liaison officers with London.
While enemy agents and resistance fighters played cat and mouse in the alleyways of Nice, Matisse's son, Jean, engaged in sabotage with the Allies.
Saboteurs are running extremely effective campaigns against the Germans.
His younger son, Pierre, provided a lifeline for artists who fled to New York, including Marc Chagall. Matisse wondered if his beloved daughter Marguerite was also working for the resistance.
Ship after ship from the New World brings to Britain fresh thousands of American soldiers to the springboard for invasion.
While France waited for the American and British liberators, Matisse worried over the fate of his family. He persevered in his art, inventing a new paper technique that led to some of his most iconic pieces. The Fall of Icarus, his profile of Charles de Gaulle, and his groundbreaking cutout book, Jazz. Then, just weeks before D-Day, his daughter, Marguerite, was arrested by the Gestapo.
My aunt, Marguerite Matisse, was working for the underground. She was arrested, she was tortured.
I've just had the worst shock of my life. No further details, no more news. Tear up my letter after reading it.
And Matisse faced the greatest challenge of his life. Matisse at War. Coming October 2025.
Make sure to silence your phones after that. Last summer, I was in Washington. I went to Arlington National Cemetery to see a couple of gravestones. One was General Courtney Hodges. My middle name is Courtney because of General Courtney Hodges. My grandfather served in the 69th Infantry Division as they conquered Nazi Germany late 1944 into 1945. And the 69th served under the 1st U.S. Army under Courtney Hodges. So I like to say that my middle name is history. The other gravestone, of course, was that of General Marshall. There's no greater hero in those hallowed grounds at Arlington than George Catlett Marshall. Now, for all of his wonderful traits that ranged from growing roses to defeating fascism abroad to being the architect of victory in World War II, his traits did not include collecting modern art, funny enough. But like his president, like the commander-in-chief, George Marshall knew that we were fighting the war in part to defend the very right to create that art, the very right to speak freely, to worship freely. Think about the 4 freedoms. And the connection between art, pioneering art, daring art, and our democracy is right past those doors behind you. You look at the posters that were developed as they were rolling out the Marshall Plan, which transformed post-war Europe. So there is a connection there, and I hope that we have that in the back of our mind tonight as I talk. And of course, this photograph up there, the 2 photographs, I couldn't be any starker. We have the Nazis on the left, that's Reich Marshal Goering, who called this type of art degenerate art, art that was fit only for the rubbish heap. Some of it was in fact burned in bonfires. But yet, here he is stealing some of the Matisse pieces for his own personal collection. And then, of course, we recognize those generals up there, the protege of Marshall. We have Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley. And they are rescuing the art. They are losing men to liberate not only the Europeans under the fascist boot, but also the property that was stolen by the Nazis. So there is a link, I argue to you, between the great general and modern art. Henri Matisse, he's a name. I know many of you have been to France. In fact, let's just throw up a hand if you've been to France. Many of you, all of you practically have, probably multiple times. So Matisse is a name that we know. But Matisse did not start as a painter. He started as a lawyer. He was training as a lawyer. He fell ill. When he was recuperating, he was given a box of paints. And he started to work on those paints, and it changed his life. He said, and I know this, I practice law. He said, I want to do something different. So he is going to become a painter, but the law practice and the fact that he's from the north of France, which is it's damp. It's on the Belgian border. It's right in the invasion path. If you're the Kaiser, or if you're Bismarck, or if you're Hitler. So Matisse grows up in this sort of damp place that was the color of potato, he once said. And he starts painting, and there's no fame to be had. He's modest. He's teaching students to paint for just a few francs per hour. And at another point, he finds himself painting at an hourly wage, the gilding of a grand Paris exhibition hall. He wasn't until he was nearly 30 when he got married, and he married Amélie up there. And the fame, when it hit in 1905, and he was 36 years old, and it hit like a thunderclap. It was this painting, A Woman with a Hat. It's his wife, Amélie, looking daringly out at us, looking us in the eye. It's not only that, but it's the colors, as if they came straight from the tube. This was not how people painted in 1905, and the critics were just confounded by this. But some were thrilled, and this painting made Henri Matisse world famous in an instant. Woman with a Hat. We see the tomato red, the green stripe across the forehead, the ear a wafer of orange. They asked Matisse, what color was your wife's hat? He said, why, it was black, of course. Ladies and gentlemen, the painting that made Henri Matisse the leader of the Fauves, the wild beast of French painting, that made him world famous, was hung in the same exhibition hall where just years before he'd been painting at an hourly wage. The Matisses had 3 children. The one on the left is Marguerite. She was the child of a previous relationship, but Amélie adopted her into the family and raised her as her own daughter. As a girl, there's so many moving sketches and paintings that Matisse did of his daughter, Marguerite reading, Marguerite sleeping. As a teenager, she was at the tip of the spear of the avant-garde, washing brushes, stretching canvases. And as an adult woman, she was even more important. She was essentially the studio manager for her father, interfacing with the great collectors, the Stein family of the United States, the Cohn sisters of Baltimore, making sure that her father's artworks made it into those collections and into the prestigious museums. Their son Pierre, up there with the violin, wanted a career in the arts, but he wasn't quite good enough, and that's also true of their son Jean down at the bottom. All 3 Matisse children found that surname as much a burden as it was a benefit. Nevertheless, Marguerite said, we were a family of artists. Matisse was born in 1869 on the very eve of the Franco-Prussian War in that hometown, the color of a potato that I mentioned. His mother, when he was a boy, told him stories about how they had buried the family valuables in the backyard. When he was in primary school, the children sang songs. One of the lyrics to the songs were, we are the children of a frontier town, born to the smell of gunpowder. When we think of Matisse, we think of the bright colors, the impeccable, pristine lines that bring us so much joy. But he lived through 3 wars with Germany, the Franco-Prussian War, and of course this second war, the Great War. World War I, it breaks out in the summer of 1914. Matisse is 44. Remember, he started painting a little bit later than his friends. He's 44 years old. He sees all of his mates in the trenches. He wants to join them. He's too old. He writes a letter to the government appealing the decision. The minister writes back, I'm sorry, you can't fight in the trenches. What you can do is continue to paint well. And so he does. But he paints paintings like this, which are far cry from what he was known for with the Fauve paintings, the ones that looked brightly colored. We have these somber pieces like this one, the Piano Lesson from 1916, Battleship Gray, Moody Blue, Deep Greens. This is a painting of his son Pierre, the one with the violin in the photograph. Here he is behind a piano. Now the piano, to some critics, were keeping him inside the house, keeping him practicing his scales. The critics thought, well, this is a meditation on Matisse, the stern father, the man from the north who speaks to his children with an economy of words. But let's look at it a different way. His son in this painting looks like a boy, but he's really 16 going on 17. He's getting old enough to be drafted into the French army. So Matisse gives us this painting where his son is literally kept by iron scrollwork, by the piano itself, in the house rather than out there on the battlefield. The piano teacher on the high stool is as much a guardian as anything. And most importantly is that metronome in the foreground, because that metronome is going tick, tick, tick. Because every day that passes, every week that passes, the 2 Matisse sons get old enough to find themselves drafted into this army in a war that is for France existential in 1916, 1917. You think about the Battle of Verdun, many of us know what that is. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men dying, and it could have been the Matisse sons. Matisse didn't talk about his art very often. In fact, he said, don't try to verbalize what your art is, but he did say this. He said, I try to translate my emotion through my line, through my color, through my shape. This is Matisse's emotion as his sons reach the age to serve in the military. Take this painting also from World War I, Bathers by a River. This magnificent canvas is hanging at the Art Institute of Chicago. Here we have 4 wraith-like figures, almost extraterrestrial. Matisse has cut the head off of one and the feet off of another. We have the color returns. We have a beautiful green on the left-hand panel and a very fetching blue on the right-hand panel. But to get from the green to the blue, you have to cross through that black maw in the middle. You have to cross through a trench. The interwar years, the years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, it's a 20-year span. Matisse makes another artistic pivot. He goes down to Nice, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, where the colors are otherworldly. And the colors return to his painting. You can see that from the paintings that I have up there on the screen. But the critics were left wondering what the heck is going on with this guy, because the interiors of hotels are the subject, interiors of flats, violin cases, flower vases, and model after model wearing couture. The critics didn't know what to think, but what they did think is that Matisse was no longer the great renovator. The surrealist had passed him, the cubist had passed him. He was no Picasso. In fact, one said he's well-fed, well-tailored. He's lost it. His family, which was so critical to his gaining worldwide fame, drifts apart at this time. The most important person in his life, his daughter Marguerite, is married. She's no longer posing for her father. His son Pierre was briefly married to a Corsican woman, and by brief I mean a couple of months, and then the marriage broke up. Can you imagine a Corsican father-in-law? He was chasing Pierre Matisse around with a pistol in southern Europe. Pierre Matisse moved to New York and stayed there for almost the rest of his life, becoming a world-renowned art dealer and champion of modern artists. And of course, their son Jean found it difficult to get his career off the ground. As for Matisse's wife, Amélie, during these years, she was desperately ill, very, very depressed. Matisse thought, well, we're down in the south now. We have the beautiful sunny skies. We have the sea breeze. She's going to get back to health. It was not to be. And so the family hired a caretaker for Madame Matisse. But again, here's a mistake that was made. They hired a 23-year-old beautiful young woman from Russia, Lydia Delectorskaya, and it didn't work. Madame Matisse was not happy with this. She said, it's me or her. And of course, Matisse, at first, was very almost rude to Lydia. In fact, he called her at one time very nastily. He said, oh, she's just the Russian help for my wife. But then one day she had her striped work shirt on, and he stopped her, and he said, hold it right there. And he took out his sketchbook, and the painting that resulted from that sketch is The Blue Eyes, one of the most famous of Matisse artworks. The family's broken apart. Lydia's installed in the household, and the critics say things like, these are works of waiting and sadness. These are works of boredom and claustrophobia. And who needs another Matisse window? But it's as if Matisse was always searching for the light that would enable him to translate that emotion through his art, through his color, and through his line. The dissolution of Matisse's family coincided with the rise of the European dictators. Mussolini in 22 in Italy, Hitler in 1933, and Franco in Spain in 1937. Now, the critics, even in the 1930s, they said of Matisse, he is the bourgeois. He is not the avant-garde painter that he once was. He doesn't have the bravery or the courage to be up in Paris where all the renovators are. He's down in Nice indulging in the pleasures of that city. He's the painter of pretty things, in other words. That was the criticism. It's lasted until today. But let me give you this evidence. He knew exactly what was going on with history. He wrote his son Pierre in New York, and he said, we are going to be invaded. We in Nice are going to be invaded by one of these European dictators, and it's not going to be Hitler. It's going to be Mussolini. And in time, Mussolini will invade France, aiming for Nice, because it's Nizza, the birthplace of the great Italian hero Garibaldi. What greater prize for somebody like Il Duce than to jump into France, grab one of their cities, and bray about it to his people. So Matisse knows exactly what's over the horizon, and it doesn't look good. The rallying cry for the Italians were Nizza o morte, Nice or death. The second European dictator opens up a war, Hitler, of course, opens up a war on modern art in 1937 with the so-called degenerate art exhibit. This was all of the art in Germany that was painted by Jewish artists, comes off the wall, comes out of the museums, goes into this traveling exhibit. All of the modernists, Klee, Kandinsky, Picasso, Matisse comes off the walls and into this traveling exhibit. The paintings were held deliberately askew. They had little placards on them that said things like, "This art," in quote, was paid, we paid 250 Deutschmarks for this back in 1924. It was, in other words, it was meant to engender mockery of these pioneering artists rather than respect or admiration. The degenerate art exhibit included works by Henri Matisse. So Matisse finds himself persona non grata, an enemy of the German state. And if Germany takes over more parts of Europe, he'll be an enemy of those parts as well, including maybe even his own country. The other art form that the Germans took aim at and denigrated is jazz. And that should hurt us in our hearts, because jazz is ours. Jazz is all of ours. Jazz is Black Americans. It's Europeans when the doughboys took it over to Europe in 1917, 1918. It's a world religion practically, jazz. And we invented it here on these shores. But for the Nazis, it was a mongrel art form. I'm saying that in quotes. It was an impure art form. The Germans had this idea called Volksgemeinschaft. It was racial and ethnic and cultural purity, oneness, sameness, homogeneity, blandness. The military war was opened, of course, in September of 1939 when Hitler's panzer divisions crashed into Poland. Now, the conquering of France was so swift in June of 1940 that one of Pierre Matisse's friends said, "It's as if a puzzle has been swept onto the floor." The international press didn't know where Pablo Picasso was. Was he up in occupied Paris, Nazi-occupied Paris? Was Picasso in the collaborationist South, Vichy? Was he even in France at all? And as for Matisse, who's somewhat older than Picasso, the international press thought he had died. He almost did. In early 1941, the stomach troubles that had bedeviled him for many years required emergency surgery. So his daughter Marguerite has to stop her life and go down to Nice, where Matisse is living with Lydia, and fetch him and take him with Lydia on a train because there was no gasoline to get anywhere. They're going to go all the way up to Lyon, which is near the demarcation line between occupied and unoccupied France. So can you imagine this poor man, over 70 years old, in terrible health, almost fatal, this disease that he had. And he has these two women who are very important to him, but who don't like each other, on this rickety train ride in an occupied part of France. He gets to Lyon, he has emergency surgery, it turns into 2. He gets an infection. He drifts for 8 days between life and death. And at the end of it, he's able finally to stand up ever so gingerly and walk out into the courtyard of the hospital. And the nurses start to call him the resuscitated one. Meanwhile, Paris under the swastika is deeply cynical. Not only did the Germans have control of that whole city, the river, the avenues, boulevards, administrative buildings, everything, but ladies and gentlemen, they hold the keys to anything of value in Paris that they want. And Matisse knows this. Again, Matisse, the so-called painter of pretty things who's indifferent to history. No, he knew exactly what was going on. This is the man who, as a boy, had been told stories by his mother. We had to hide our valuables from the Prussians. He writes his son in New York. He says, and I quote, "I know what efficient removal men the Germans can be. They're going to show up at my bank vault one day with all my art, a lifetime worth of art. Not only my art, but Cézanne and other famous artists that he's collected. They're going to show up one day with the keys." And one day they do show up. And it's not his estranged wife who helps defend his art, and it's not his daughter Marguerite, who's living in occupied Paris, who helps defend his art. It's the owner of the other 2 vaults, Pablo Ruiz Picasso. We already briefly talked about this, so I won't belabor it, but that is Goering stealing. There's no other way to put it. Looting, stealing art that doesn't belong to him for his own personal collection. These are, you can see the Matisse in color and then in black and white. Perhaps the most fascinating discovery I made in the research for this book was the friendship that blossomed in early 1942 between this handsome guy here, his name is Louis Aragon, and Matisse. Louis Aragon was a surrealist poet. He was a member of the humiliated French army that had lost the war so quickly in May and June of 1940. In fact, he was evacuated from Dunkirk, and he was sent over to England, and he makes his way back to France, and he joins the resistance. And this, you think about this, he's a communist, he's a surrealist, he's a veteran who's come back and is now, trying to take it out on the Germans. Well, the Gestapo get wind of this, and they put a dossier on him, and they track him down, and they arrest him, imprison him. But he's using an alias, and they don't figure it out. So he's mistakenly freed. And in his moment of freedom, Louis Aragon, who will become known as the poet of the French resistance, uses his moment of freedom to go down to Nice to meet the great French artist, Matisse, the symbol of France, the symbol of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The man who trained as a lawyer before turning to painting, who always found a way to embed in his painting that glorious blue, the French blue, that meant so much to his country, all the way back to the monarchy. In early 42, Aragon goes down to Nice because he wants to write a book about Matisse. So every day he goes to the Matisse apartment and he has his notebook and he sits across from the great artist and he writes down observations and things that Matisse says. And he finds out that Matisse isn't very talkative. And in fact, Matisse, who can't really stand up anymore without pain, is in a seated position opposite him, and he takes out his sketchbook. And day after day, he sketches Aragon, and Aragon gets fed up with it at one point. He says, I was there to take the measure of Matisse, but he was taking my measure. But nevertheless, the two men became great friends till the ends of their respective lives. Aragon finally got around to writing that book about Matisse in 1972. And in that book, he hearkened back to the dark days of the occupation, and he had this to say about his friend. He said the time had come to be aware of the national reality of Matisse, because he was of France, because he was France. Matisse didn't need to be a sloganeer. He didn't need to pull a pin on a hand grenade and throw it at the Germans for the French people to know where he stood on the issues, the great issue of freedom or slavery. He stood for those three words that are on every French building: liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And the French people knew it. I'll give you more evidence of that. The great photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson escaped a German work camp and did the same thing. Went down to Nice to meet Matisse, and he found the same thing. Matisse doesn't talk that much. Matisse is there with a pigeon in one hand and a sketch pad in the other. He's drawing it with one hand, holding it with the other, as if by magic. But perhaps the greatest evidence of this is the words of Picasso's companion during World War II. She was a young woman named Françoise Gillot. She was in her mid-20s. She herself was a painter. And she said, we had the great resistance poets, Eluard and Aragon, but we also had Matisse. And she used these words: he was a beacon to us French people in the darkest days. In 1943, Matisse began work on not only his greatest work of the wartime, but one of his greatest works in his long career. And it wasn't a sculpture and it wasn't a painting. It was a book made up of colored paper. He would take these large rectangular sheets of canson paper. Again, he's at a seated position. He has to do it this way. He can't be at the easel. So he's seated. He takes these big, large pieces of thick paper, colored to his exacting hues, and he takes out his shears, and he cuts these organic shapes or jagged shapes with the same precision as the paintbrush or the pencil, because that potato-colored hometown of his, it was a textile hub. So he grew up watching this and playing with it, and it became part of his repertoire. When he thinks he has a prototype, he asks Lydia to pin it on a wall, literally using push pins. So when you see these up close, they have hundreds of pinholes. And he would spend a couple of days. He would have her pin it up a different way. He would take photographs of it. He would think about it. And then he would say, aha, that's my prototype for my book. What's my book going to be called in World War II? He's going to call it The Circus. I think this is deliberate. What better way to carve out your opposition to Nazism? They have Volksgemeinschaft, cultural sameness, oneness, homogeneity. I have the circus, the democracy under the big top, the sword swallower, the human cannonball, the Roma, everybody, men, women, children, under the circus tent. The circus tent is democracy. It's not pretty sometimes. Sometimes it can be startling. Sometimes there's ugliness and there's grotesqueries in the circus. But that's democracy. That's a picture of Lydia, by the way. Lydia across from Matisse, taken by Cartier-Bresson. He didn't finally call it the circus. He wound up calling his book Jazz. And it was democratic in nature because these are paper cutouts that you can peel from the book. You can fold it up and loan it to a friend. You could take one out that you liked and put it on your kitchen wall. This was not meant for a Russian industrialist or an American titan of industry. These were meant for the people, these prototypes that were in this book, Jazz. And again, you think Matisse is trying to translate his emotion. And I'll give you a quote from his son, Pierre, who spoke to the New York Times in 1942, the middle of World War II. And Pierre Matisse knew many more modern artists than his father because he was an art dealer in New York and he knew all the players. Pierre Matisse says to the New York Times in 1942, the artists, when they paint during war or during national trauma, they're not going to paint, cannonballs and exploding shells. That's not how they operate. They'll somehow paint something more subtle. And it's up to us to stand before those artworks and look at them with reverence and spend some time to think about the context of that painting or that artwork. And so I give you this. This is the cover of what Matisse called Jazz. It's called The Clown, but it's not very circus-like and it's not very funny. The clown is a torso without hands or feet. He has what look like welt marks or whip marks. There's also evidence or a whiff of being in prison or a jail cell or a torture cell. So this is it's colorful and it's Matisse. So on the one hand, it raises our blood pressure goes up and we think this is wonderful. This is the bringer of joy with those wonderful Matissian colors. But when you start to look at it, there's a latent violence to this that was present in many of the jazz plates. Take this one on the left, the sword swallower. You have to ask yourself, is that a circus performer or a torture victim? There were elements in the jazz plates of powerlessness. And again, Matisse is an imprisoned person in his own body, and he's imprisoned in his occupied country. He doesn't have the gasoline, the petrol, the access to an automobile to go anywhere. He's trapped. And so you think about the powerlessness of Icarus, that figure falling through deep space. We think about the toboggan, which was another image from jazz, a figure being pulled across the horizon without the power to stop it. And you think about the most heartbreaking image of the whole sequence, which was a picture called The White Elephant, which is a circus elephant balancing pathetically on a little ball. They asked Matisse about it. And Matisse said, "The elephant, c'est moi. It's me." They asked Lydia, what's the deal with the color white, the white elephant? And she said, well, that's the color of animals in captivity. And there's also images of hope. Take this transformation of the sword swallower on the left. You think about Lydia maybe placing one of these cutouts on the bed where Matisse was working or on the wheelchair. Maybe she places it upside down or to the left when it should be to the right. And Matisse, who always took artworks anyway and flipped them upside down to, quote, see the strength of the line, says to himself, that looks familiar. That looks a lot like the profile of General Charles de Gaulle. So he gives us this plate as well in 1943-44. It's called Monsieur Loyal. And commentators even then recognize this as the profile of the general. We have the defiant chin, we have the Gallic nose, we have the kepi hat. And Matisse, who could be very subtle, wanted to be less subtle on this painting, I think, or this cutout, because he put these little gold buttons or gold circles on each side of the profile, which mimicked the buttons on the general's uniform. He called this cutout Monsieur Loyal, which is the French phrase for ringmaster. And I like to think this is Matisse speaking to us through the decades. I think he's saying something like this with this artwork. The circus is going to be leaving town. We, France, are going to be getting a new ringmaster, and the Republic is back. 1944, however, was a year of wait and worry for the great artist. His beloved daughter, Marguerite, who had been a consistent correspondent with him, always writing letters, keeping him up to date, she finally went silent. And Matisse was overcome with worry. Where is she gone? And he thinks back to 3 episodes. He thinks back to 1940 when she sent her only son to live in New York for the duration of the war. So she is unburdened by motherhood. That's a clue, number 1. Clue number 2, she tells her father at one point, I would rather die with guns in my hands than live under the German yoke. Clue number 2. And thirdly, she says very ominously to him at one point during the war, I will make myself useful up there in occupied Paris. And so she does. At age 50, Marguerite Matisse, headstrong, not herself in the greatest of help, but her courage more than made up for it. She joins the French resistance. Her mission, and I've seen the paperwork in France, in Paris, her mission, she was given a code name. She was given a mission to take information from Paris by train, using this code name and this alias to the coast of Brittany in advance of the Allied invasion of Normandy. And what she was also told, which is not in the paperwork, but what every French resistance fighter was told, was if you are arrested by the Gestapo, you have to be quiet, you have to not talk for the first 1 or 2 torture sessions so that we can cover our tracks. Matisse is beset with worry when his daughter goes silent. And his emotion at that moment, well, he's not going to tell us what his emotion is because that's not his style, but he's going to make this cutout. This is the wolf. The wolf has those Matisse-ian colors, ladies and gentlemen, that give us so much joy. We have the blue, we have that stripe of orange on the right, the fuchsia. We have the organic leaves over there on the left. But that central image is the most dismaying, violent image of all of Matisse's career. Lydia said this was the beast with the blood-stained eye ready to bite. And the late curator Reva Castleman in New York said, the wolf, the beast, that was a stand-in for the Gestapo in 1944. Matisse, as you can see up there from the quote, got the news that not only his wife, but his daughter had been arrested. And he set about to try and find out where they were and what he could do for them. He found out his wife, Amélie, was in a prison outside of Paris. She was over 70 years old. She had been typing up on an Hermes typewriter instructions on how to use a Sten submachine gun for the communist underground. And for those of us who have been to France or know French people or French women in particular, the reason that she chose the communist underground is because they were the best organized of the resistance networks. She was given a 3-month sentence, which was doubled to 6 months. 70-year-old woman. As for his daughter, he sent his son Jean up to Paris. Go up there and try and find out what you can find out. He could find out nothing. Matisse asked around friends. They could find nothing. Finally, he had to hold his nose, and he reached out to an old friend of his who turned collaborator. And he said, you're friends with the Germans now. Can you find out anything about Marguerite? The answer was no. So when we think of Matisse, we think of this bringer of joy, whose impeccable, pristine lines leave us breathless, who, when we stand before his artworks in Baltimore or Paris or Washington or Nice, they almost allow us to transcend our condition and let us at least dream for a moment about something greater than us. It's magic what he was up to. But when we look at our Matisses in the future, please consider that this man lived through one of the bloodiest chunks of history that you can imagine. 3 wars with his militaristic neighbor to the east. 3 wars impacted Matisse's life, and yet he still defiantly created these remarkable works that give us so much sustenance. With the 3rd war that intruded on the life of Matisse just months away from finishing, he found that the beast had his beloved daughter Marguerite in its jaws. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's been my pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to your questions. And remember, I come from a teaching background, so I welcome the hands raised. to find out what happened to Marguerite, you have to go into the upstairs to the library and get yourself a book afterwards, which I will inscribe for you and personalize for you. Yes? The full book did not come out during the war. The full 20 plates came out in 1947. But during the war, starting in 1943, they were being put in a magazine called Verve in sets of 3 and 4. So people were actually seeing the clown, the white elephant, the Icarus image. In fact, the Icarus image has these stars in it, and Louis Aragon, that poet, said that in 1943, when that came out, we understood the stars in Icarus to be exploding shells in the night sky. That's a great question, number 2. Verve was not considered by the Germans subversive. It was too subtle for that. What the French were doing with each other, and Matisse also was doing this with his friend Aragon and with other people, was they were skirting a line where they knew the censors didn't have the time or the wherewithal to sort of figure out what they were doing. And not only were they doing, Matisse would build the tricolor into so many of his works during World War II, the French tricolor. And, he'd do it in a flower vase, or he'd do it on the border of a painting. He wouldn't paint, like a soldier from World War I, but he'd do it more subtly, and that evaded the censor. But what he and Aragon and other people did was kind of genius. They started going back to the heroes of French history that meant something symbolically to them. And I'll give you an example that was that Matisse latched onto during World War II. He latched onto a guy named Charles of Orleans, who was a French noble who was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Charles of Orleans was kept in a London prison for over 20 years. He was kept there for so long that he almost lost his ability to speak French. And he became a poet in English and returned to some of his French roots. But Matisse did a book on this guy that he illustrated and did the writing for. And it was a love letter to his people. It was a love letter saying, this is an ordeal for us that might last a long time, but we are going to come out of this on the other side with our Frenchness intact, with our ideals intact. That's a long-winded way of answering your questions. And I'll add to my answer to your question, surely the dairy farmer in Normandy, might not have known the ins and outs of what Henri Matisse was doing, but there was a band of French society, the poets, the writers, the notables, the thinkers that knew exactly what he was up to. And again, going back to the words of Francois Gillot, saw him as a beacon, saw him as somebody who was theirs, who was defiantly remaining and defiantly painting. Yes, sir. Question is about Matisse's body of work, what works might have been looted, what works are still missing. Scholars think there are over 100,000 artworks still missing to this day. And even though the efforts to return the stolen art began immediately during the war, right, with the Monuments Men, with the picture that I showed you earlier. As for Matisse specifically, and people might know the story that just happened. In South America, there was a apartment that was listed on one of the real estate websites, and people looked at the pictures for the apartment listing, and they noticed a painting on the wall that had gone missing during the war. It was a looted piece of looted artwork, and of course they had to then track that down. So this is even 80 years later, this is still happening. We are still finding artworks among those over 100,000 missing artworks and trying to return them to the rightful owners. As for the Matisses specifically, there were 6 that were taken from his dealer, Paul Rosenberg, who was Jewish, had to flee for his life to the United States. And Goering finds himself this second most high-ranking Nazi, taking looted artwork from a Jewish dealer, 6 Matisses, and keeping them in his private collection during the duration of the war. Those were returned, as were the other Matisses. The last Matisse to be returned was about 10 years ago. It wasn't one of the Goering Matisses, it was another one. But All of the Matisses, there are no known Matisses that went completely missing. They've all been recovered, fortunately. Any other questions? We have this side doing a little better than this side. Yes. I love that question. And what's your name? Cecile, I love that you asked that question. The question is about the relationship between Picasso and Matisse. I came into this research, knowing that Picasso was a jerk. Picasso was a jerk. He treated his women in his life badly. David McCullough, the great biographer, was going to work on a biography of Picasso, and he said, I don't want to deal with this guy for 8 or 10 years. So he flipped over and did the biography of Truman, which was a game changer for us, right? For us Americans. And that's still true. After my book has been written, I still think Picasso could really be a jerk a lot of the time. There was one episode that I talked about where he and his followers were throwing lit matches at a Matisse that he had in his studio, which is just gross. It's a terrible thing to do. But it was more complex than that. Picasso respected Matisse more than he respected any other living artist. If you think about Picasso, did he have the ability to look up to anybody? If so, it was Matisse, one person. And in fact, I'll give you evidence of that. There's a quote that's been attributed to both Matisse and Picasso. The quote is this: when one of us dies, there will be no one else for me to talk about these issues with. When one of us dies, there will be no one else for me to talk about these things with. And it's as if Picasso and Matisse knew that, yeah, there was Klee and Kandinsky and Bonnard and all of these other painters, but they were the two twin towers of modernism. They were speaking the rarest of human languages, only spoken by two people. So there was respect there. There was frenemy. You might have heard your granddaughter talk about being a frenemy with somebody. Frenemies, grudging respect, but also a rivalry. It hurt Matisse when he heard stories about Picasso being the great pioneer, the great renovator, and that wounded him because he wanted to continue to be in the avant-garde. They did. Picasso, they had a personal relationship, and in fact, Picasso, to his credit, would go down and visit Matisse. And that's especially true just after the war, 1945, 1946. 1947, Picasso went down to the South to spend time with Matisse quite regularly. And they had a shared belief that they were in a chain of artists that went all the way back to the Lascaux caves, the caves in the Dordogne region of France that were discovered during the war. And it went all the way 20,000 years ago, all the way into the future that they would never see. And they thought of themselves as being in a chain, Cézanne, Rembrandt, and so forth. So they had these marvelous conversations that I hope to have discussed at some length in the book. Yes, thank you, Cecile. Yes, sir. Yes, somebody, renovator, pioneer, someone who is bringing dynamism to their art. And the best way I think I can describe it is the Germans and the Nazis and the Vichy regime in France, they criticized modern art. The Germans, in fact, outlawed flat roofs. Flat roofs. You had to have a peaked roof. And they did that with their painting as well. The French Vichys and the Nazis hearkened back to the 19th century. They wanted to see naturalistic, they wanted to see landscapes and portraits and in the color that reality is in. But when I say renovator or pioneer, I mean, Matisse and Picasso and Klee and Kandinsky, they weren't trying to recreate part of the universe on canvas. They were trying to make their canvas a whole new universe. So I hope that answers your question. It would be. I could see innovator, pioneer. Yes. I used renovator because I think Pierre Matisse at one point used renovator as it was vis-a-vis describing Picasso. Picasso's the great renovator, whereas my father is considered this tired old bourgeois, and it wounded him. Yes, any other questions? This side has done well now. We pulled even. John, how are we doing on time? We'll take maybe one or a couple more. Yes? We're looking at a picture of the chapel in Vence, and the question is about the relationship between Matisse and the Dominican nuns up in the town of Vence. And it is a wonderful story. 1942, his doctors thought he was going to die in 41 or 42. So he hires a night nurse in 42, Matisse does. Her name is Monique Bourgeois. Her father had been wounded in World War I, never recovered. There's no pension, they have no money, their family goes hungry. She doesn't have a penny to her name. And she answers this ad to be a night nurse for Matisse. And over time, they become friends, and later in their friendship, she poses for him. And he puts Monique Bourgeois, who's never had 2 nickels to rub together, in these grand gowns with jewelry and couture, and he elevates her. He gives her dignity in these magnificent portraits of Monique during the war. And it doesn't stop her from doing what she needs to do in her life. She tells Matisse that I'm going to take my vows and become a nun. And Matisse is angry with her. How dare you? You're my model, you're my friend. She says, well, I have to do what is God's will. So she becomes a nun, and they basically break up their friendship. Years later, 1947, Monique comes back into his life. Sister Monique Bourgeois comes back into his life. She brings a little sketch that she's drawn. She says, Monsieur, would you consider making us a stained glass window for our leaky garage that we're using for our chapel down the street? And he says, I'll do you one better. I will fundraise, design, build, and do all the art for a brand new chapel. And that became, from 1947 to 1951, the chapel at Vence. Raise your hand if you've been to that chapel. Regardless of your affiliation religiously, you just are in awe, right? In awe. In awe. If you haven't gone, please find time to make your way to Nice, which is a beautiful city, and also up to Vence to see that chapel. It's just a short bus ride away. Folks, thank you very much.